Being a member of the legendary comic pair Laurel and Hardy, Stan Laurel had a special talent for making people laugh, and his charisma endures to this day. But his life was filled with struggles that most fans were unaware of, despite his giggles. Stan's life wasn't simple, filled with both career struggles and devastating personal losses. Losing his son to the terrible clutches of death was one of the most heartbreaking blows he ever experienced. But before we go into the sorrow and loss, let's pause to reflect on the wonderful times in Stan Laurel's life, the joy he brought to millions of people, and the complete picture of the tough comedian. On June 16, 1890, Arthur Stanley Jefferson, better known as Stan Laurel, was born in his grandparents' home in Ulverston, Lancaster. His parents, Margaret, an actress, and Arthur J. Jefferson, a traveling actor and theater manager, were too busy acting to care for a kid on the go. As a result, Stan grew up with his grandparents, George and Sarah Medaf, and became quite comfortable in Ulverston. Stan wasn't merely playing with toys and hanging out. He seemed to be getting a serious sweet craving for Gillam's General Store's trickling toffee beer, and he was taking in the sights and sounds of church with his grandparents at Holy Trinity. Just across the street from his grandparents' house at the Hippodrome Theater, Stan's passion for the stage began. His parents played in a theater with a wooden canvas ceiling. There, his father would develop some of the plays for which he would become famous. Thus, Stan wasn't merely playing in the streets as he grew up. He was becoming familiar with the theater's magic by attending performances. Unfortunately, the Hippodrome burned down in 1910. However, Stan sailed to America that same year, but we'll talk about that in a movie. Before going to schools like King James I Grammar School and the King's School, Stan lived in North Shields for a while with his grandmother, Sarah Medaf. After a while, his family relocated to Glasgow, where Stan's father was the manager of the Metropole Theatre. Stan truly got into the performance bug at this point. He entered the world of theater at the age of 16, playing his first paid performance at Glasgow's Panopticon. He most likely understood at this point that it was a pretty nice bargain to be paid to make others laugh. With the stage name Stan Jefferson, Stan joined Fred Karno's company in 1910 at the age of 20. Since his companion soldier wasn't just any soldier, this is when things really started to get interesting. Charlie Chaplin was the one, yes. As they traveled around doing slapstick comedy, the two future legends were probably attempting to outsilly one another. Stan even had the opportunity to serve as Chaplin's assistant. The rest is comedic history. They both boarded the same ship to the United States. Stan enlisted in the military when the globe was at war. However, he was given a free pass because he was deaf and a resident alien. But nothing was going to stop him from becoming a great comedian. Stan wasn't content to wait for the next big thing. Once the Karno troupe split in the spring of 1914, he joined forces with Edgar Hurley and his wife Ethel, two other former Karno performers, to become the Three Comics. They changed their name to the Keystone Trio, a reference to the well-known Keystone Cops who were popular in comedy at the time, on the suggestion of their booking agent. Stan began tinkering with his persona during this stage, imitating his longtime friend, Charlie Chaplin. The Hurleys, meantime, started portraying Mabel Normand and Chester Conklin, two silent film stars. After a successful tour from February to October 1915, the trio disbanded, and Stan embarked on new endeavors. Stan Jefferson formed the Stan Jefferson Trio with Alice Cook and Baldwin Cook from 1916 until 1918. This collaboration went beyond the stage. Baldwin and Alice would become longtime companions. However, Stan met Oliver Hardy, another significant character, in 1921. For a short time, they collaborated on the silent film The Lucky Dog. However, it wasn't yet the renowned collaboration that we all know and adore. During this period, Stan also met actress May Dahlberg, who said that the 13 letters in his stage name, Stan Jefferson, were bad. Stan changed his stage name to Laurel and started over, just like any other good, superstitious performer. Soon after, Laurel had an offer of $75 per week to star in 2 genuine comedies, which he seized. Universal gave him a contract after he finished his debut movie Nuts in May, but as is sometimes the case in Hollywood, the deal didn't last long. It was canceled due to a studio reorganization, but Stan was unfazed. Among the several movies in which he and May co-starred was the 1922 satire Mud and Sand, which had its own unique brand of absurdity. Stan signed a deal with Joe Rock to star in 12 True Comedy by 1924, demonstrating his complete dedication to the film industry. The film industry. There was a peculiar clause in this agreement. None of these films permitted the appearance of May Dolberg. Stan was being held back by her temperament, according to Joe Rock. Therefore, Rock provided May a monetary settlement and a one-way trip back to her home country of Australia in 1925, when she began to interfere with Stan's work. Their collaboration came to an end when May agreed. Stan's career, however, was only beginning. Stan produced a number of comedies between 1924 and 1925, such as Mandarin Mix-Up and Detained. Even though he didn't star in any of them, he had directed or co-directed 10 silent shorts by 1925. 3 of these films did, however, feature Hardy, his eventual comedy sidekick. Indeed. Comedy's sidekick. Indeed. Madam Mystery, Nanette, and Wandering Papa. Laurel's career was progressing steadily. The foundation for him and Hardy becoming one of the greatest comedic partnerships of all time was being laid, even though they weren't exactly a formidable combination yet. The next significant development in Stan Laurel's career was his signing with Hal Roach Studios. He initially intended to concentrate on writing and directing, and in 1925, he even made the movie Yes. Indeed, Nanette. Oliver Hardy, who would later become his comedic sidekick, played Babe Hardy in that movie. However, life had other ideas. Hardy, who starred in the Hal Roach Studios comedy All Stars, was hospitalized after a kitchen accident that same year. Stan was requested to fill Hardy's role in the movie Get Him Young because Hardy was out of service. The situation changed at this point. The magic began to happen when Stan and Oliver started sharing the screen. Laurel and Hardy were a well-known on-screen couple by the beginning of 1927. They appeared in a number of short films, such as with Love and Hisses, Slipping Wives, and Duck Soup. There was no denying the chemistry between the two, and the people at Roach Studios quickly noticed how the audience reacted to their antics. Seeing their potential, director Leo McCarey started teaming them more often, and later that year, the renowned Laurel and Hardy series was born. The group soon rose to prominence as one of the silent film era's most popular comedic groups. Producing a strong selection of shorts including Be Big, Should Married Men Go Home, Two Tears, The Battle of the Century, and Big Business. Even the switch to talkies in 1929 didn't slow them down because they had such a natural rhythm. Unaccustomed as we are, their debut sound picture was a success. Later that year, they appeared in a feature film for the first time as part of the review segment in the 1929 Hollywood Review. They appeared in the all-color Technicolor musical The Rogue Song the next year. With their first full-length starring film, Pardon Us, released in 1931, Laurel and Hardy achieved yet another significant milestone. And they continued the trend, producing shorts and features until 1935. They even won an Academy Award for Best Short Subject for their 1932 short, The Music Box. Comedy Gold. They were slaying it. However, as anyone who has ever reached a high note is aware, perfection is a fleeting state. For Stan Laurel and Hal Roach, things became a little difficult in the 1930s. A significant disagreement resulted from the two's falling out over contract concerns. Roach had several contracts with varying expiration dates for Hardy and Laurel. This implied that Hardy's contract was still in effect even though Laurel's was. As a result, Roach retained Hardy in the studio and cast him in the 1939 movie Zenobia, among other comedians like Harry Langdon. The Hardy Family, a new television series starring Hardy and Patty Kelly, was even considered. He sued Roach over the contract issue since Laurel would have none of it. Laurel finally returned to Roach Studios once the court struggle ended, but their relationship was never quite the same. Both Laurel and Hardy would soon come to the conclusion that it was time to permanently leave Roach. In 1941, Laurel and Hardy agreed to a 5-year, 10-film production deal with 20th Century Fox. To Laurel's astonishment, however, the two were only employed as actors. No artistic influence over the movie composition, production, or editing. The creative freedom they were accustomed to at Roach was a far cry from this. Nevertheless, the movies were successful, and Laurel and Hardy were given more latitude as their fame increased. They gradually started including their own content and personalizing these movies. They would go on to establish themselves as one of the most recognizable pairs in the history of entertainment. However, tragedy came in 1957, and on August 7th, 1957, Oliver Hardy passed away, just as their light was shining brighter than ever. Half of one of the most adored comedic duos in history also left with him. Stan Laurel was taken aback by the news. Laurel had lost the only person who actually understood the weird, amazing rhythm they shared, as well as his best friend and creative partner. In a silent, sorrowful moment, he murmured, "Baby would understand, even though he was too sick to go to the burial." Barrett, Abuelo. And you would know that was most likely the case if you knew anything about their bond. However, Hardy's passing signified more than just the termination of a business collaboration. With that, Laurel's career as a performer came to an end. He was offered the chance to go back on stage and screen, but he declined them all. He just didn't want to work without Hardy, not because he was arrogant or obstinate. Without Babe, the act wasn't the same for Laurel. In all honesty, nothing was ever truly again. Even though the loss was extremely difficult, Laurel had to deal with many tragedies. There was enough upheaval, drama, and grief in his private life. The world witnessed a man who made them chuckle. They were blind to the extent of his suffering after the spotlight faded. Dot. Behind the famous bowler hat and slapstick genius of Stan Laurel was a guy whose private life frequently resembled a tragic melodrama more than a comedy. Laurel was silently bearing the burden of heartbreak, controversy, and intense personal grief, while viewers chuckled at his on-screen antics. The tragic death of his baby boy was the worst of all. The history of Laurel's relationships alone reads like a soap opera. Although he and his early lover, May Dolberg, lived together as common-law spouses from 1919 until 1925, they were never legally married. In his early career, Dolberg was crucial. She even contributed to the creation of the stage name Stan Laurel. However, producer Joe Rock purchased a one-way ticket for Laurel to return to Australia after determining that Dolberg was impeding her career. She went out. The drama didn't stop there either. Dolberg returned to the United States in 1937, more than 10 years later, and sued Laurel for financial assistance. He was going through a challenging divorce with his second wife at the time. Even if the issue was resolved out of court, the public display was just one more bitter note in an already disorganized personal symphony. The litigation only made matters worse. However, it was nothing in comparison to the events of May 1930. Stanley Robert Laurel, a boy, was the second child born to Laurel's first wife, Lois Nielsen. He was 2 months early. Tragically, Stanley passed away 9 days after his birth, despite the couple's best efforts to hold on to hope. For a man who dedicated his professional life to making people laugh and smile, this loss was a personal and heartbreaking loss. One that surely left a severe scar, but which Laurel never discussed much in public. No amount of applause or slapstick could make that pain go away. A convoluted string of weddings and remarriages continues to dominate Laurel's married life. He married Virginia Ruth Rogers in 1935 after divorcing Lois in 1934. That was swiftly dismantled. Although Lois wasn't interested in rekindling their romance, he acknowledged that he still had affections for her. After that, there was Ilana Shuvilova, whose turbulent marriage ended with accusations as outrageous as Laurel trying to kill her in the backyard. In 1940, that marriage fell apart. Laurel then remarried Virginia Ruth Rogers, maybe out of habit, but divorced her again in 1946. He married Ida Kitava Raphael that same year, and she would be by his side till the end of his life. Stan Laurel continued to appear on television smiling, despite all of the public scandals, personal tragedies, and divorces that made headlines. However, that smile belied a guy who had suffered more than his share of hardships. Losing his closest creative partner, losing a child, and then losing love again and again. Similar to the movies that made him famous, his life was tragically shown in black and white. Stan Laurel quietly left the limelight as the illustrious Laurel and Hardy collaboration came to an end. But he did not lose the affection of his followers or the respect of his contemporaries. Even though he lived in lowly circumstances, his legacy grew even after his performance days were over. For his innovative work in the field of cinema comedy, Laurel received an honorary Oscar from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in 1961, acknowledging his enormous contribution to comedy. But too weak, there was no denying Laurel's influence, as he went to the ceremony himself. Danny Kaye accepted the prize on behalf of Bob Hope, who presented it, a heartfelt act that demonstrated how much Laurel was still adored and respected in the entertainment industry. Even though Laurel starred in almost 190 movies, he spent his last years in a modest, unassuming apartment in Santa Monica's Oceanana Apartments, rather than a mansion in Hollywood. He had not been spoiled by fame. In truth, Laurel often took fan calls himself and kept his number in the public directory. He never lost the humility that had won him millions of admirers, and he took satisfaction in responding to fan messages. He might simply answer the phone and start talking like an old friend if you were fortunate enough to call him. He was frequently sought after as a mentor by comedians who wanted to follow in his footsteps. In addition to paying him a visit, Jerry Lewis also incorporated Laurel's influence into the bellboy by giving the lead character Stanley's name and introducing a Bill Richmond character who was fashioned after Laurel. As a young performer, Dick Van DJK experienced a similar experience. After locating Laurel's phone number, Van DJK called him and received an invitation to come visit. Van DJK later honored him by playing him in a Dick Van DJK Show episode. These were not merely expressions of adoration. They were recognitions that their work carried on Laurel's comical heritage. Laurel declined an appearance in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, which director Stanley Kramer offered her with comic icons Buster Keaton and the Three Stooges. He was determined not to show up on screen without Hardy. He also allegedly didn't want to be remembered when he grew old. He remained steadfast in his devotion to his deceased lover. It was still intended to be a subtle reference, a backdrop image of a double sitting in an antique convertible while wearing Laurel's trademark bowler hat. However, even that fleeting homage was eventually altered, with Jack Benny making an appearance in the final cut while wearing Laurel's hat. Stan Laurel never really left the stage, even though he did eventually move away from the camera. Laurel remained a timeless character in the world of laughing through the comics he helped create, the people he thrilled, and the classic movies he left behind. Calm, polite, and still searching for the ideal joke right up until the very end. In talking of the end, Stan Laurel lived a tranquil life in his last years, away from the attention that used to follow him everywhere. His health was beginning to deteriorate by the middle of the 1960s. Doctors performed a number of tests in January 1965 after discovering an infection on the roof of his mouth. Then he had a heart attack in February. He died quietly in his armchair a few days later, on the 23rd, at the age of 74. A silent farewell from a man who once made the world laugh without uttering a single word, without any great pomp or dramatic conclusion. Church of the Hills in Los Angeles hosted his funeral. Although it wasn't a huge Hollywood extravaganza, it was packed with individuals who actually thought highly of him. The eulogy was delivered by Dick Van DJK, who had become close to Laurel in his later years. He was always more than just a comic hero in Van DJK's eyes. He regarded him as a mentor and friend. Additionally, Buster Keaton was present to honor someone he thought was exceptional. Hollywood Hills Cemetery's Forest Lawn is where Stan was laid to rest. Even though he was no longer with us, his impact was felt everywhere. The celebrity and the 190 films weren't the only factors. It was the legacy he and Hardy left behind, the giggles they shared, and the model they established for all subsequent comedic duos.